staff who are here, to our local board reps and everybody else. So we've got, let's just start with apologies from Maylene Brown, Councillor Chris Darby, Councillor Stewart and Councillor Watson. Have we got any other apologies?
Apologies for early departure at 3 o'clock,
For
Madam
a
Chair.
very important. Okay. Any other lates or earlies? No, Fletcher for lateness, is she? Okay, I'll move those. Is there someone who will second those?
Aye.
All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. Declarations of interest. No. Minutes. I'm happy to move the minutes of the 14th of April. Seconded. Councillor Penrose. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. We've got our board members here. Extraordinary business, no notice of motion. Nope. So let's get into it, and just reminding everybody, so these Auckland Development Committee meetings discussing and updating people on the unitary plan. This is our opportunity to ask questions and understand and remind ourselves of how we've got to where we've got to, but obviously there are no decisions to be made, so there's no debate to be had, as this is just building up our layers of knowledge as we head into the decision making later on in the year. So, John.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, councillors and local board members. So this is the second of our information briefings in the lead up to the recommendations coming back from the panel on the 22nd of July. Number 2 of 6. So in this meeting, as indicated in the report that was sent out on Friday, we're covering 4 topics, and we're starting off with the regional policy statement, then we're moving on to the RUB, Rural Urban Boundary. We're going to talk about the coastal plan, and finally the port precinct. So those are the 4 topics. And as with all of these presentations between now and 22nd of July, the format is essentially a bit of a recap, a bit of information on what was actually in the plan when it went out for submissions September 2013. The views of a range of submitters, so we'll try and summarise those without getting too specific, because it's very difficult when you have on some topics, well, in excess of 1,000 different points of view, but we'll do our best on that. Then we move on to what was the Council's position going into the hearings, and that was generally based on direction from the Auckland Development Committee or the Unitary Plan Committee. In some cases, if there was no change in position compared to the plan that went out for submissions, that we essentially just went into the hearings with that as the Council position. So the regional policy statement. I have Chloe Trinauf here with me. Chloe was our lead planner on 2 of the 8, I think, topics in the regional policy statement, and Chloe helped pull this presentation together, so it's Chloe's here to give me some assistance. And we also have the lead planners on all of those main topics in the regional policy statement, in case you have any more specific questions. So the regional policy statement, the hearings lasted for about 5 months, so these were massive hearings. This was a big event, and the reason for that is, I guess, the regional policy statement is the engine room, if you like, of the unitary plan. Everything else in the unitary plan is intended or should sheet back to the regional policy statement. It doesn't contain any rules, but it sets the broad vision and direction for Auckland, and it has objectives and policies, and talks about methods, but it doesn't actually have the specific rules themselves. The rules come later in the unitary plan. So under the RMA, regional policy statements are required to identify the significant issues for the region. All regional councils must have a regional policy statement at all times. As I mentioned, it sets out that strategic direction. A bit of jargon, but integrated management has always been the key phrase for regional policy statements in Auckland under the former regional council and also across the region. The idea of, aligning all of your district plan rules and your regional plan rules with an overarching vision and direction in an integrated way. That's the language of the RMA. Specific wording here, the district plans and regional plans within your geographic area, so within Auckland in this case, must give effect to the regional policy statement. So that's that kind of hierarchy there, as we mentioned at the information briefing a couple of weeks back. This RPS is intended to be read as a whole. Some regional policy statements may have a different approach, but the approach that we developed with the Auckland Plan Committee at the time before notification was that you read the plan as a whole. There is no hierarchy within the plan. There's no one chapter or topic that's more important than the other. You have to read it as a whole. It's got a very strong link to the Auckland Plan, so one of the real benefits of doing the Auckland Plan in advance of the Interim Plan was a lot of that strategic thinking, big direction stuff had been developed by the council, had been engagement with Aucklanders, a lot of feedback, so that formed a really good platform for the regional policy statement that went up for submissions. And also, I guess there was a lot of good work that had been done by the Legacy Regional Council in preparation for a potential second generation regional policy statement before the amalgamation. So we had some really good material to build on. Regional policy statements also required to give effect to the national New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. So we've got two national policy statements, three mentioned on the screen there, and also some national environmental standards that we can't be inconsistent with those. We basically have to give effect to those through the regional policy statement. This diagram we popped up at committee a couple of weeks ago. It really just shows with the RMA sitting at the top, government responsible for national policy statements and environmental standards and regulations. Then we get into the unitary plan, and here's the engine room here with the regional policy statement. It's mandatory for all councils, as I mentioned, to have a regional policy statement. It's also mandatory to have a district plan and a regional coastal plan, but other regional planning documents, as we mentioned previously, dealing with things like air quality, water quality, are not mandatory, but most regional councils have them, and we have that in our unitary plan as well. So the RPS is broken down into 8 chapters. Those are the key headings for the chapters there. And for each of those chapters, there are a range of issues identified in the regional policy statement on urban growth or issues of significance to mana whenua, natural resources, coastal, rural, so really broad spectrum of topics there. And as I mentioned, that's, I guess, not surprising in that everything else in the unitary plan has to sheet back to one of those 8 major issues for Auckland. So what I'm going to do is go through each of those 8 chapters one at a time and take some questions at the end of each chapter. So first chapter is quality urban growth. As I mentioned, there was pretty strong guidance in the Auckland plan there around the quality compact Auckland or city. There are 7 sections within the growth chapter of the regional policy statement. That's the 7 chapters that you see up there. I won't read them out, but obviously quality compact city, public open space, social infrastructure, those all sit within that chapter of the RPS. So in the notified plan, we've just captured half a dozen of the key bits of policy there. The first one is that strong link to the Auckland Plan development strategy. The second one is the introduction of the idea of a rural-urban boundary as distinct from the old metropolitan urban limit. So there's a big extensive description of what the rural-urban boundary is. The line itself also sits within the regional policy statement, and we'll have a presentation in about half an hour on the specific rub line. That focus of urban growth in and around centres with particularly those with high public transport frequency. Coordinated release of new greenfield land, the strong policies around when new greenfield land will be available for development, and the need for that to be coordinated with the provision of infrastructure, in particular the bulk infrastructure, the main transport routes, interchanges, wastewater treatment plants and so on. And lastly, that strong emphasis on the quality of the built environment sits in this chapter of the RPS. Urban design quality, urban design review, all sheets back to this part of the unitary plan. References to the affordable housing provisions that sit in the lower tiers of the unitary plan, social infrastructure, schools, hospitals and so on, and public open space to support growth. So what did the submitters ask for? The majority does support the idea of the quality compact urban form. some sought greater expansion in greenfield areas, and some sought greater intensification in urban areas, in particular what some submitters refer to as the market attractive areas, that's where you're likely to get the most development happening, so the unitary plan should allow for more development there. Others said that there should be far more analysis before that approach is undertaken. There were concerns raised about impacts on housing supply by having mandatory affordable housing. So I guess there were some, mainly from the property development sector, saying, look, if you require us to provide housing at an affordable rate, that will actually make it less viable for us to develop, and therefore you might get less housing, and that might have an unintended consequence. And infrastructure providers right across the regional policy statement, all 8 chapters that we're talking about here, sought greater recognition of infrastructure than we had in the plan that went out for submissions. Council's position at the hearings, really essentially continuing to support the overall approach in the notified version of the plan. Some amendments to the RUB, and that's that separate presentation in a second. We did propose to define a rural-urban boundary around some of the rural villages and settlements, but not all of them. We continue to emphasise that the development of land in future urban areas must be in a timely manner, coordinated with infrastructure, and we put in a reference to the Council's future urban land supply strategy that the committee adopted probably 8 months ago, a year ago perhaps. Yeah. So that was adopted in time for us to, at the regional policy statement, say that there should be a link between that document and the unitary plan. And the mandatory approach for affordable housing when rezoning land in the future urban areas and the greenfield areas, but we moved towards more of an incentive approach in existing urban areas, and that was brought through the committee in advance of that change in approach. So saying that in new greenfield areas there must be a certain quota of affordable housing at an affordable price point to individuals or people on a certain income threshold, but we did move more towards an incentive approach in the existing urban area. Where we have received guidance from the panel, we'll just do a quick summary of that as well, so you can get a sense of where the panel was sitting at that point in time. A key thing to stress is that the panel said that this was really just a snapshot in time, but its thinking may evolve as the hearings progress, and certainly there's been a lot of water under the bridge since the hearings on the regional policy statement. They finished in February last year, so there has, the panel has heard a lot more evidence and a lot more specifics. And so, the panel's approach may have changed. But I guess the good news was that the panel did support the quality compact urban form, higher densities around centres. They did support the use of the RUB. But a key point here is the third bullet. And you may recall this because we did report this back to committee, their preference was to move the RUB line from the regional policy statement down to the district plan chapter of the unitary plan, and the key thing there is that it can then be amended by way of a private plan change. The regional policy statement can't be subject to individuals, companies, organisations applying to council to change things, but if it's in the district plan, it's wide open to private plan change requests, which can always be declined, but it certainly means that the council has to do a lot more work than if it was sitting locked into the RPS, debated once and in there, but that's where the panel was at on the 25th of February 2015.
That should be strongly opposed.
Right. What else is a key point from the panel there? They supported the idea of structure planning. So before any new greenfield areas, rural areas are rezoned for urban development, they shouldn't just be zoned for housing. There should be some thought put into the mix of housing and business, where the key transport routes should be. Should there be any should there be a school in the area? Where should that school be located? Where should the open space be? They support that whole approach of having structure planning tied in with any rezoning of land, which was good. But they unfortunately didn't agree with the link to the future urban land supply strategy. I think the reasoning there was perhaps that that's a document sitting outside the unitary plan that can be changed and updated, and they felt a bit uneasy about it. They support the idea of coordination with infrastructure, structure planning, but they didn't feel that wording should be in the unitary plan.